We're running about 10 minutes late, and let's get started. I'll start talking so that the people, late stragglers, will interrupt me and not the important speakers. So welcome to day 2 of the CRS Symposium. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kang. I am the CRS faculty director. I've been directing this program now a total of 4 years, not continuously, but this is the end of my 4th year, and I'm delighted to be a part of this symposium. We're in day 2. In day 1, among other things, we thought about color blindness in a panel called Seeing Color Blindness. In a second panel, we thought about the contextual context and consequence of color blindness, and we have 2 panels today. This one called somewhat opaquely Bigger Pictures, and then the final panel dealing with interventions. What I want to do this morning is give a little bit of framing of this entire symposium as well as this particular panel, and then let the speakers do their magic. What most of you might not know is that even before the public symposium started, we had all these interesting scholars come together and talk about their work even before in private sessions. And after this public symposium actually finishes, we're going to force them into a small room to collectively brainstorm and work through hard issues for a 2-hour spree while I madly type and map things as people go along. The point of the project is to bring people from different disciplines with different ideas, different vocabularies, indeed different ways of seeing the world to think hard together about this thing called color blindness. So you will see and hear, and as you did yesterday, vocabularies, methods of analysis, assumptions, moves, certainly degrees of humor that look different in part because people come from different histories, backgrounds, and different areas of expertise. And the whole point, if you thought was interesting, disturbing, confusing, novel, the whole point is to bring that interesting mix into this crucible of CRS so that we can think new thoughts, right? That's our goal. We have to think new thoughts, teach them to the world, and transform the way social justice works. So more is coming, and the end product will be ideally an edited volume with articles, a scholarship jointly created by the people whom you've seen in the past 2 days. Okay, that's the point of the symposium. Let me talk a little bit about this panel, Bigger Pictures, which again is somewhat opaque. So yeah, let me make 4 comments, and I think that will help understand what this is. First, givens. Second, questions. Third, techniques. And 4, cautions. First, givens. I think most people think we live in a colorblind meritocratic tournament right now. This society is basically a colorblind meritocratic tournament. There will always be winners and losers in a tournament. It's okay. If you feel bad, give some charity to the losers. We call that tax and transfer policy. We're done. The only time we really get upset is if it's not a colorblind tournament, if some disparities that exist in status quo can somehow be traced back to some prior bad act. And we'll just leave it ambiguous, bad acts. So it's okay that we have winners and losers. Disparities only concern us if you can trace them to some prior bad act in time. We don't really know what a bad act is, but we can hypothesize something called a bad act. Now here's the sticker, right? The second point is there are almost no bad acts today. That's what people think. We're colorblind, descriptively. There are no bad acts. The third point is that the bad acts of the past are long gone. So really, there's no problem to solve. Disparities by themselves don't bother us unless they're connected to bad acts. There are no bad acts right now. I'm colorblind, so are you. And the really bad stuff that happened a long time ago, there's a shelf life. There's a statute of limitations. There's an expiration date. That stuff's long gone. I think that's where we are right now. So there's 2 questions that are put on the table in any conversation about colorblindness and how to analyze the problem. One is, are there bad acts still going on today? Again, there's explicit denials. We just elected a black president, for God's sakes. I'm not racist. Are you? No, I'm colorblind. So are there in fact bad acts going on today? And second, have the bad acts of the past really expired? Those are the 2 basic questions. They might even be related, because it might well be that the bad acts of the past persist through the mechanisms of implicit biases, of culture, of other things that lead us to make bad acts today. But those are the two important questions. Right now, are people doing bad stuff? And second, the bad stuff of the past, does it persist? Now, for many of you, the questions have obvious answers, but I'm claiming we live in a moment right now where the obvious answers go the opposite of what you think for most of America. So how might we, the third point is to deal with techniques, how might we find out what the answers to those questions are? Again, are there bad acts today, and have the bad acts of the past expired? Well, it turns out there's multiple methods and multiple units of analysis. For example, you could use non-science, and you could use science. Non-science would be telling a story, for example. Science is telling a particular kind of story that uses null hypothesis testing. But how we know whether or not there are bad acts going on today, for example, through the mechanism of implicit bias, something I know a little bit about, or if structures and institutions allow the bad acts of the past to persist, those are questions that we have to ask and answer, and we can do it through science and non-science. In many ways, we have social scientists all throughout, and with and among the scientists, even if you pick science, it turns out you could do it at different units of analysis. From the very bottom level of the neuron, up to the brain, up to the individual, which includes brain and body. We should remember that as we sit in these uncomfortable chairs for 2 whole days. Family, firms, groups, institutions, structures, cultures, histories. You can pick whatever unit of analysis. If you're trained to think about neurons, you look at neurons. If you're trained to think about history, you look at history. How you cut the problem at what level of this vertical stack will tell you different kinds of things. So how do we know, and how do we find out the answers to these basic questions? One of the points of this panel, bigger pictures, is to think about science versus non-science broadly, but more importantly, to think about what is the proper unit of analysis. To create maybe a stylized conflict, many people are anxious with the invocation of social cognitive neuroscience that tries to put the blame within the mind of a single individual. Indeed, that has been called the perpetrator perspective, which is consistent with the liberal model of anti-discrimination law, which many people have pushed back on within the critical race traditions as being inconsistent, insensitive, and not responsive, in some sense, to the broader questions of power and history, two themes that we must always be conscious of whenever we think of race. So I leave with the fourth point, cautions. Since we've done the givens, we've done the questions, we've done the techniques. Here are the cautions for the entire panel. I want to avoid either-or fallacies. I don't want people to say, well, if we don't study it by sociology, we can't possibly study it by any other means. It must be either sociology or psychology. It must either be fMRIs or cultural studies. I don't think that case has been made, so no either-or fallacies. If you think that they are actually mutually exclusive, then make the case. Second caution. Distinguish metaphor versus mechanism. Metaphor versus mechanism. We love metaphors and we think through metaphors. But arguably there's something different with mechanisms. We want both. We need both. Certainly lawyers need both. Third, I want everyone to be ruthlessly honest about something very simple. Turf wars. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you've been trained to wield your mind like a hammer, you want everything to be a nail. If hammers and nails are in high demand, you've got a job and you've got graduate students and you've got invitations to conferences. These are the kinds of things I want to think about on how we solve these problems. With those three cautions, I'm going to introduce this panel. We have really a superstar list of people. I hate reading verbatim the profiles that are in your pamphlet, so I'm not going to actually talk about them. They'll speak in this order, and I'll quickly introduce all of them, and you can go one after each other. We have Tristan Green, a law professor from Seton Hall, who's a remarkable talent in anti-discrimination theory, who's visiting at Berkeley. We have Vicki Mays, who's a professor of psychology here at UCLA, who has done also really important things about both health disparities as a function of race, and she will talk a little bit about those subjects as well as memory and emotion, I hope. Daria Roithmayr, a professor of law from USC, who has done, again, really interesting things about how to think about the past influencing the present using the metaphors and the mechanisms of antitrust law, complex systems, and lock-in theory. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva, who is a professor from Duke in sociology, who has written amazing books in all kinds of ways, and you can tell from his presence and the force of his comments that he always has provocative things to say, and he will be talking about other things, racial grammar. And Stephanie Fryberg, who's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, who will talk not only a little bit about colorblindness, but about invisibility, oftentimes in the context of the American Indian experience. So we have remarkable people. Each one will go for 10 minutes. We'll go straight down the stack. I'll ask hard questions, try to pick fights, and have people join us along the way. So with that, Tristan Green.
Okay, so thanks first to Jerry for inviting me to be here. This has been an incredible experience so far. Really, I've learned so much and expect to learn a lot more today. What I thought I'd do today is talk really about three different points, and mostly about kind of how social science might fit in with the law and how we might use the law to affect reform. First, I'm going to sketch what I think is an initial hurdle, which picks up on some of the points that Jerry was just making, at least in the law and legal scholarship right now. And that is an overly narrow conception of discrimination, which I think is being driven or at least perpetuated by an over-reliance on the cognitive bias literature. This tendency to, and a colorblindness norm, really, right? The in part a desire to keep this within individual minds, and I don't think it's the social sciences' fault. I think it's the legal scholarship that's pulling this into the law is over-relying on this concept of individual minds. And then I'm going to briefly summarize a project that I've been working on, trying to think about how we can use some of this in the law. And then I just want to throw out an idea for your thoughts. So in my work, I've been trying to better understand discrimination as relational, and to begin to explore the possible implications of that understanding for the law, particularly for anti-discrimination law governing private employers, so Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And I think that in the legal scholarship, so in my first point, I think that in the legal scholarship and in the law, we've seen a shift over the past decade or so, a positive shift toward understanding that individual biases may not be always conscious, and that implicit biases may nonetheless drive discrimination and lead to disadvantage for women and people of color. And this, I think, has been a tremendous effort. It's not without its challenges. It's currently being contested, but I think it's a positive movement. Leaving those challenges to the side for a minute, though, I also think, at least want to raise the possibility that in undertaking to better conceptualize discrimination to include unconscious biases, unconscious reliance on stereotypes, and even to conceptualize discrimination in terms of the structural forces that may facilitate those biases, we may be losing the relational component of discrimination, that we may be overemphasizing the individual. And one of the things I found so exciting in the conversation yesterday and in the research of the people yet to come today is this emphasis on how race emerges and affects interracial interaction, and on how broader environmental contexts shape those interactions. So whether we're talking about organizational cues, which I think is the term that Miguel used yesterday, color blindness versus multicultural systems, which is the term that Victoria used, social representations, which I think is what Stephanie refers to, or diversity discourse that Phil Goff was referring to, right? All of those shape our interactions, not just our individual mindsets. So my first point is that. In thinking about the law's role, and here, I guess, in some ways is my turf war. I'm a law professor, so I think about the law and how we might be able to use this in the law. In thinking about the law's role, I've been working on a paper in which I examine the use of, the conscious use of race and sex, but of use of race in organizing work. in staffing work teams, in assigning people to committees, in assigning clients or job tasks. I mean, these are the decisions about how work gets done and by whom, rather than who gets into a firm in the first place or where they fall within a particular job hierarchy. And I think there's a certain diversity rhetoric, which we know about and we heard about yesterday, that translates into a particular narrative about how race is relevant at the level of organizing work. And pursuant to that narrative, my sense is that race is relevant primarily as a means of serving particular markets and signaling adherence to egalitarian norms and obedience to non-discrimination laws. Some of the research presented here in this conference, and also other research supports it, suggests that these uses of race are likely to entrench inequality. And not just because they're based themselves oftentimes on group stereotypes, but because they tend to stratify work and in a way that's likely to create stereotype-confirming interactions. They shape the context for interactions in a way that may facilitate stereotype-confirming interactions. At the same time, though, there's this research that suggests that taking race and sex into account in organizing work might actually serve as an important discrimination-reducing measure. If you think about critical mass, about power dynamics within institutions, if you're staffing a work team, you might think about how many black people are on that team and what their power dynamics are, in thinking about how you're shaping the interracial interactions between those people at work. So there's kind of the social science component that I then try to draw into anti-discrimination law and thinking about anti-discrimination law. I think it's particularly interesting in thinking about the use of race at this level of organizing work because there's a difference in the effect on individuals in these organizing work decisions than in the hiring or promotion decisions. One difference is that the difficulty in discerning whether this is really a benefit or a harm, or a little bit of both. You think about the benefits, the possible benefits are largely relational benefits, the opportunity to interact with powerful people. Think about a faculty appointments committee. When you're put on a faculty appointments committee, that's prestigious, but part of that prestige is because you're going to interact and create relations with these other powerful people, and those interactions may give you an opportunity to disconfirm stereotypes, to show that you're really smart, that you're as competent as you want them to believe. The other interesting thing at this level is that race in organizing work can impose costs on the individuals, even when it's intended to further broader anti-discrimination goals. And that's not true when we're thinking about promotion or hiring. Usually, in that context, we can be pretty sure that if you're to hire this person, that's a preference. Not necessarily so at the level of organizing work, because this person may be doing extra work, right? Tangible extra work that may affect their career success, and also be suffering some degree of identity harms. So I try to argue in this project that Title VII should, and this is a legal argument in a large respect, but also a normative one, that Title VII should permit race-based decisions in organizing work when they're intended to reduce discrimination, to further anti-discrimination goals, not when they're to further business diversity interests, so standing alone, though those two will sometimes overlap. And that although it permits those race-based decisions, they must be tied to broader integrative efforts. And here's what I call a micro-macro requirement. If we're going to impose costs on individuals, we must be serving the broader anti-discrimination goals in order for that to be justified. And this is actually consistent with the law regarding affirmative action in this area. My hope is that we can use the law, thinking of Title VII this way, we could actually use the law to harness business interests to further structural reforms that will create opportunities for collaborative work and functional integration. Okay, so there's that project. The last thing I want to do in my remaining seconds is to spark thinking on emotion as a component of relations. Once we begin to attend to relations in anti-discrimination law, we may begin to see that our job, or the law's job to the extent it has a role to play here, is not just to eradicate or minimize bias in individual mindsets, but to redirect relations to the positive rather than the negative. And here it comes back again to the conceptualization of discrimination. Focusing on individual mindsets, I think, makes it easier for us to push the emotion that's associated with racial interaction outside of the realm of discrimination and group-based disadvantage. I'm most interested here in what I call discomfort, that there's a whole range of emotions that we might explore. And my sense of the law is that now we tend to push that emotion outside of the realm of discrimination and into the realm of the personal. It's a personal conflict when emotion's involved. It's discrimination when it's that more cold decision not to give someone a benefit because of their race. So I'd like to think about, what if we redrew the boundaries to include emotion? What would that look like? Is it possible for the law to facilitate conditions for positive emotions in racial interactions? How would we go about doing that, and what role would the law play?
Thank you very much.
I want to thank my colleagues here at the law school for having me here today. One of the nice things about being here is that I get to learn. You know, in all the other places we're so busy doing, and so to be able to take some moments to kind of be in the audience and to be a learner, I really appreciate, so thank you. What I want to talk about, because this is big picture type panel, is actually consequences. I want to talk about consequences of colorblindness and consequences of race-based discrimination, and probably should say just a little bit about where I'm coming from, because one of the things people have been doing is identifying their turf, and it's like, I don't have anybody to fight with in terms of my turf because it's a little different, but I want to put it out there anyway. And that is, we've talked about people coming from social science backgrounds, and we've talked about social psychologists. I'm actually a clinical psychologist, and the way in which, for me, that's important is that I've been trained to worry about people's mental health. I've been trained to worry about the individual. You know, I've been trained to, look at kind of what happens as a result of something, and then what do I do for that person. That also led me to be very frustrated as I started to try and do something about racism. I mean, as a clinical psychologist, you sit and somebody tells you their woes and you try and deal with it and you try and send them out the door a better person. And you sit there and you say, what did I do today that changed the world? I changed the person. I hope the person changes the world. But I didn't want to work at that level. So, and I wanted some different tools also. So I went and I was trained in social psychology because I wanted to work at a broader level. I wanted a different set of tools, and I wanted to make a difference in a way in which I thought it was more than just dealing with individuals. So I've kind of been back to school twice, and that, so one of the nice things about UCLA is I've been able to kind of take time off, because I also went back once I was able to get those tools and have a voice where I thought I could make a difference. I needed to know how to do it well, so I went back to school yet again to learn policy. So for me, in coming at this issue of colorblindness, it really is this notion of having both the time, the techniques, and the tools to try and work both at the individual level, to hear the stories and understand how, for example, a colorblind policy impacts an individual, and taking what I hear and then figuring out, because the only way you make change is the stories don't really do it. They may be powerful, but at the end of the day, when you're talking about the federal government and dollars, et cetera, they really want a bigger case made, as they say, the business case. So it really is then going back to the structural, really understanding where can we insert this policy? What kinds of policies are needed? And how do we actually get a sea change? And so for me, I'm trying to work between them. I'm trying to go back and forth. And I actually think that's very important. And I think, that's one of the things I'm going to advocate. But what I want to do is start for right now in terms of consequences and say, I don't think we know consequences of colorblindness that well at the individual level. Many of us have been focused very much at the structural level, and we've very much been trying to deal with a policy. I mean, we see it in terms of an individual who doesn't get into a program. We see it in terms of kind of that level at which someone has a grievance against a situation. But what we don't know is what is the long-term consequence within that individual for that colorblind policy. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about an experience that I had. I had a paper that was published, and it's on race-based discrimination, and negative outcomes. And it was picked up by the LA Times, and in addition to the LA Times, there were also some radio shows that we did. Well, my phone just went nuts in the sense of the number of people that were calling. Most of the people that were calling actually wanted me to come and testify in cases and stuff. I went, oh, wait a minute, now you really are getting me out of my expertise. Call over to the law school. But what they needed was science to help them. And so I heard a lot of stories. And it really kind of changed a little bit of my approach in terms of research. But individuals will call me and they would tell me how discrimination, how being in settings where I had to act like I wasn't black. And so I actually, some people kept me on the phone hour and a half, but I'm going to tell you, I learned a tremendous amount. What I learned is what we have to, I think, really work on. For example, there were African American men who called, and in particular I was struck by two of them who had been in the military, and they were let go. And and you could hear the pain. You could hear that this was their career path, and it was discrimination. And they really felt that life was over for them. The notion of lost opportunities, all the things that they could not do. I mean, I was trying to be a bit of a clinician and reframe for them and get them to rethink about other avenues. But it was interesting in terms of the damage for them that had been done. And I remember hanging up after talking to one of them, and I was trying to think as a clinician, what could I do at an individual level to really turn this person around? And I realized it was going to take years. And you realize what the loss was going to be for that person in terms of how long it was going to take them to heal. But what they really wanted was a policy. They really wanted someone to really hear them in a way in which you make a rule, you make a law, you do something that says this is wrong. They really didn't want to hear me say it was wrong. They really wanted at another level for it to be deemed that it was wrong. And I really at that point understood that it was better that I do things at this, broader structural level as opposed to being a clinician. I also heard about people who were in work environments in which they talked about their feeling that the reason they had lost their job, or their feeling that the reason in which they were not being promoted was because they were black, because of the ways in which they, in their everyday life, performed what they considered to be their right to be a black American, and how that was in conflict. They would talk about butting up against policies. They would talk about, things like they didn't like what they talked about. They didn't like the way they laughed. They didn't like, they didn't seem to have the same kind of desires and likes and et cetera that they had, and that they always felt like the odd man out in the work environment. One of the things that these stories did was reminded me actually of being here at, I don't know if it was last year or year before, but when you did the Katrina workshop. One of the things that I remember walking away with, but I didn't know how I'd internalized it, was walking away with the notion that sometimes what you need to do is to not ask a person merely about the incident that occurs to them, But what you really have to do is, in order to come up with a way to fix it, is to understand more about their broader life. And I think even when we were working on the center grant, I remember this notion about these, thinking about human rights interviews. And I remember asking you all, kind of about this. And what I realized is that when we talk about racism and race discrimination, we quite often measure a moment in time. We quite often go after an incident. But what we're not doing, I think, and this is where, I'm going to get to what Jerry's talking about, is in terms of these methods and tools. This is why I think we have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. There is something wrong with our science right now. One of my recommendations is developing a new science, because we keep doing this slice of life. But I think at the same time, it's very important for us to say, what was the incident that may have sparked this? But we have to go the next step and ask the question, but what has it done to you? What is it that you're losing? What is it that you're not able to do? To what extent has this now, excuse the term, colored your whole life? And that's where I think, I really want to push this boundary about reframing of colorblindness, because I think we sit in this post-racialist environment. People believe that, we talked about this yesterday, so I don't want to, beat it, but it's like there is no race problem. I think we have to get out front and really clearly say what the race problem is, but we can't do it in terms of these small slices of life. I think we have to do it in terms of really understanding the ways in which there is a consequence to individuals, in terms of being productive citizens, in terms of having dreams and aspirations, in terms of being whole people in relationships. For me, I work in the area of health disparities, and I actually talk about, I just don't understand why it is, given the experiences that we have of discrimination, that when you look at African Americans' mental health, we have lower rates of mental disorders. Everything that we know about mental disorders say that we should have a lot, but we don't. But we have a lot of physical disorders. So there's a transformative process that's going there that we have to learn about. Very quickly, let me just say there's a couple of other things in terms of, I think we have to think about accountability. When we do this work, what is the end goal? And who will it reach? And I think we're not asking those questions. We're doing nice little cute little studies, but I don't know that we are putting them in a way in which they can be used by our colleagues. Ethics, I think I want to put on the table that I think that if we keep coming up with studies saying that white people have a problem, then we need to figure out what we need to be doing about the problem, not just documenting the problem. And finally, the imperative, if not now, when are we going to do this? I'll stop there.
Thank you.
So I want to start with a very short story, a post-inauguration story. A group of black Washingtonians is wandering off the mall after the inauguration. It's bitterly cold. A young woman says to the group, "We need to do something to keep warm. I know, let's sing We Shall Overcome." Older black man responds to her, "Weren't you just watching? We just overcame." And I think that the idea that we have overcome is one that will start to dominate our conversation about whether we are living in a quote-unquote post-racial society. And so I think it's within this framework that I'm really excited finally to be done with a book manuscript that I've been working on for, well, I shouldn't say how long, but 8 years. And you'll understand why when I tell you about the project, for those of you who haven't heard me talk about it, which I did last year. But before I talk about the project, I just want to say a preliminary word about method and turf. I think in my work I focus much more on the level of the group, for example, in conversations about something I call racial cartels, and about structures, for example, in looking at informal job referral networks. And it's because I think it's here that history and power, which we discussed yesterday, tend to operate at least more visibly. At the same time, I think it's possible to link up that work with work on the individual. And I'll talk about ways in which my work both does that and opens the door for other folks to do it. So the book, in general, asks the question, why does racial stratification persist? even after the enactment of the civil rights laws. And the answer is that racial disparity has become self-reinforcing and locked in, and that stratification will persist as a result even in the absence of individual intentional discrimination. I'm certainly not claiming that that day has come yet, but even if one were to imagine that tomorrow individual discrimination, subconscious and conscious, were to end, my argument is that racial stratification would persist nevertheless. The work draws very heavily from a most unexpected place, antitrust regulation, and more generally complex systems theory, because it analogizes persistent racial inequality to persistent market monopoly. And here I draw from work on something called the lock-in model developed in the context of antitrust theory. And that model takes as its prototype a story that we might find familiar about Microsoft, in which Microsoft gains an advantage through illegal conduct in pushing its operating system, Windows, on the market, mostly through illegal contracts. And it turns out that after Microsoft gains that small but important illegally obtained advantage, that advantage then becomes self-reinforcing through the following mechanism. It turns out that software authors love to write for the most popular operating system because it gives them access to the widest base of consumers. In turn, consumers like operating systems that give them access to the widest range of software. As a result, each increase in software authors produces an increase in consumers, and in turn, each increase in consumers produces an increase in software authors. And as a result, after Microsoft gains this small but important advantage, that advantage begins to snowball because it's become self-reinforcing through this feedback loop process in which early success breeds later success, or it takes money to make money. And so hopefully you see now the analogy to persistent racial disparity. And the analogy takes place basically in 3 steps. The first step is to understand historical exclusion as a species of anti-competitive conduct by racial cartels, groups that act to exclude people of color for political and economic advantage. Here in social psych terms, one could draw on, and I do draw on, work on group conflict theory, which talks about the way in which society forms in-groups and out-groups for many reasons, but in part to compete over scarce resources. And I make the argument that racial cartels operate for political and economic advantage. And for example, I look at the Kenwood Property Owners Association in Chicago, which collaborates with real estate boards and banks to exclude people of color in order to create a dual housing market, a segmented housing market in which they monopolize access to the best housing at the lowest prices with the wealthiest neighbors. And so that's the first step, understanding historical conduct and exclusion as cartel conduct. The second step is to sketch out the way in which the early advantage gained by those racial cartels, and I survey a range of them, now has become self-reinforcing through these feedback loop processes, in which early success breeds later success and early disadvantage breeds later disadvantage. And here I look at 4 different types of feedback loop processes that reproduce that early unfair racial advantage. First, there is intergenerational transmission of wealth, in which parents pass down wealth that their parents pass down to the next generation. And in particular, I focus on inter vivos, the gifts that you get during your lifetime from your parents' transmissions, because these have a way of making much more of a difference in terms of creating wealth in the next generation. All of you know that getting help on your college tuition or making a down payment on your house will enable you to make a lot more money down the road, to accumulate a lot more wealth down the road. And it turns out, as one might expect, that there are significant differences in the ability of families of color to provide that sort of help to the next generation versus white families. Again, it takes money to make money. The second feedback loop that I look at has to do with social network effects, It takes network contacts to make network contacts. And in particular, I focus on informal job referral networks. Over 50% of all jobs are filled through these informal referral networks. And again, there are huge racial differences in how well-connected, well-resourced, and well-employed those informal job networks are. Why? Because of historical job differences. Again, early success breeds later success. Early disadvantage breeds later disadvantage. Third, I look at neighborhood effects. And this is basically network effects, but localized to a particular geographic space. It takes wealthy neighbors to make wealthy neighbors. And here I focus on the way in which public financing, which ordinarily draws from the wealth of the surrounding community, can determine the wealth level of the kids who attend school in that community. And I focus on the way in which whites' monopoly on well-resourced public schooling persists over time, again, mostly because of these structural reasons. And when one looks to the origin of neighborhood effects, one finds, of course, historical residential segregation, the creation of neighborhoods of color which concentrate not just race but wealth. Poverty on the one hand and advantage on the other. And then finally, I look at workplace rules of distribution, in which getting there first means you're more likely to see people who look like you in the next round. Those who are first to occupy a profession will choose rules of distribution that favor their group and will mold workplace tasks to fit them. So there's great organizational theory work on something called the attraction, selection, attrition cycle. That is, the people you attract to a workplace already will be people who look like those who are already there. Those who you then select will constitute an even more homogeneous group, and those who you retain after a period of time will tend to even more closely resemble the both cultural and demographic makeup of the existing members of the profession or the industry. Those who get there first can create what they call returns to power. That is, they can create workplace rules of distribution that will favor people in their group. And there's some really interesting work here done just on non-racial characteristics of CEOs, their tendency, for example, to favor marketing ways of looking at the CEO job versus finance ways of looking at the CEO job. And at the end of the antitrust regulation era, where it became really important to differentiate a company, CEOs began to adopt a marketing way of looking at the world, and that started to reproduce itself over time. Finally, the last step of this analogy is to argue that racial stratification may well have become locked in the absence of significant government intervention of the sort that characterizes, relatively uncontroversially, antitrust, in which these feedback loops are dismantled. So, for example, one might imagine prohibiting the use of informal job referral networks until a workplace has a critical mass of people of color, in which that critical mass can then begin to create a network to reproduce the racial composition of that workplace. I end with a depressing note, which is the strong possibility that we may be locked in without the ability to pay these high switching costs. Whites are very well invested in retaining the privilege of monopoly in jobs, housing, education, and politics. But I think social science certainly has a lot to offer in terms of investigating ways in which we might dismantle those self-reinforcing feedback loops of power. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm really glad to be here for two reasons. First, because the conversation we're having is not the kind of conversation that I hear in sociology. The second one is more personal. I always wanted to be a lawyer. And although my style, some people tell me, probably would not be acceptable in the courtroom, but I feel really comfortable, playing, pretending I'm one. So it has been really nice to talk, in the law school and tell all my folks. I keep calling folks in Puerto Rico, hey, I'm in the law school. I'm like, you're a lawyer? Like, well, sort of, Because I want to keep it together within the 10 minutes, I'm going to sort of read from this text, but I may get inspired, which is not a good thing. Although the beast of white supremacy rules in visible ways, practices such as police brutality, racial profiling, tracking in schools, etc., its rule is cemented in everyday life through almost invisible practices. I have written on the visible aspects of the beast, on what I call the new racism, as well as on colorblind racism. And there is a book that if you haven't purchased, I still have kids in college. But I'm now working on the field I label racial grammar, and I should point out dominant racial grammar, which I contend shapes how we see, interpret, and even feel about race matters. Hence, reason and tolerance will not help us challenge or change this grammar, for as Albert Memmi pointed out, a refutation of racism's formal arguments is wholly insufficient. One must strip bare the underlying system of emotions and convictions that structure its discourse and govern its conduct. Let me explain what I'm talking about with two examples. I titled a chapter in a book in the making on this subject, Beauty and the Beast. The subject came to me out of an aha moment. I was watching the Nancy Grace show, a CNN crime show, and heard her say the following: breaking news tonight. At yet another college campus, a beautiful 22-year-old president of the UNC Chapel Hill student body, double major, biology, political science, last seen 1:30 a.m. doing homework, 5 a.m., shots fired, 22-year-old Eve Carson found dead in the intersection near campus, multiple gunshot wounds. Did you catch the problem with this statement? Probably not. That's what I'm here. Journalists seem to always describe a missing or murdered young white woman as beautiful. My RA checked transcript of similar crime shows to see if there was a pattern, and found that in cases where young white women disappear or are murdered, John Benet Ramsey, Natalie Holloway, Chandra Levy, Lacey Peterson, Jennifer Wilbanks, remember Jennifer, the one with the funky eyes? Yeah. The adjective, you remember the picture? She always had these eyes like, The adjective is there, but when the victim is a black or Latino woman, they are seldom discussed by the media, and we are two victims of murder and violence. And when mentioned, the adjective beautiful is not there. This phenomenon has been discussed by media critics and minority victims group advocates. Roy Peter Clark of the Poynter Institute said, sex sells, kidnapping sells, but not every kidnapping is equal. Sherry Parks, professor of American Studies at Maryland, calls it the missing white woman syndrome, and suggests that, quote, since we can't solve all the problems, since we can save all the women, this woman becomes a symbol. That's what happens to people. This woman becomes a symbol, and if we save her for a few days, we are okay. The notion of racial grammar helps us understand the structure of this unsavory racial situation. First, stories about whites become universal stories about all of us. This is how whites' racial imaginary frame these stories. But of course, this is not the case. When Lacey Patterson, Natalie Holloway disappeared, and I'm sure that all of you know these names, LaToya Figueroa, you know LaToya Figueroa? A black Puerto Rican pregnant woman from Chester, Pennsylvania, disappeared too. Second, the beauty element in these stories reflects what Toni Morrison has articulated so well in novels such as The Bluest Eye, that all modes of representation in our culture tend to idealize the desire for whiteness and devalue the presence of blackness. This social fact remains despite years of symbolic and practical struggle against white supremacy and its manifestations. Normative whiteness is still out there as the cultural distillate of 500 years of racist culture, a culture that since Kant and all the other enlightened white boys of Europe and America has depicted non-whites as ugly and particularistic, and whites as beautiful and universal beings. Now I discuss an example that is closer to the subject of this conference, race in colorblind spaces. The racial character of HBCUs is tattooed in their name. The name leads people to believe these colleges are all black institutions. In truth, 45% of the faculty in these institutions is non-black. However, we never think about the whiteness of HWCUs, historically white colleges and universities. We seldom question the history and practices that created and maintain these institutions as white institutions. Instead, these places free ride in our minds as universalistic organizations, that is, just as colleges and universities. We should begin naming things, yeah? So call them HWCUs. Your colleagues will love when you do that. However, these colleges have a history, demography, curriculum, climate, and set of symbols and traditions that embody, signify, and reproduce whiteness and white supremacy. For example, traditions in HWCUs predate their so-called integration, and thus many are exclusionary, such as homecoming. And some are almost innocently exclusionary, such as Friday afternoon tea at Smith College. Some of these traditions are highly racialized, as the case of offensive anti-Indian mascots throughout the USA. A lot of the symbols in HWCUs create an oppressive racial ecology where just walking on campus is unhealthy, where minority students, and all of us minority ontologists who walk around, feel, as one observer commented, as guests who have no history in the house they occupy. There are no photographs on the wall that reflect their image. Their paraphernalia, paintings, scents, and sounds do not appear in the house. HWCUs that create or co-create college towns such as Madison, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Michigan, State College, or College Station, Texas, reproduce the whiteness of these institutions. Hence, local business, local people, cater to white-only or white-mostly business interests. This in turn leads to a defending turf type of mentality when dealing with people of color. For example, 4 years ago, an employee at Ed's Express in Madison, Wisconsin, where my son is studying, approached a group of black students eating dinner and told them, quote, "I'm sick of you people leaving piles of shit all over our tables," and added, "I want you to leave the premises. I don't want you here." I will do much more in this book in chapters such as Watching Whiteness. So, shows like Everybody Loves Raymond, but Raymond didn't love us back, yeah? or Friends, and some of us got silly and got hooked with Friends. This is a white show, yeah? We are not part of the friendship crowd, yeah? Another chapter is Who's the We in We the People? Another one is All of Our Children, dealing with child abductions. The other one, I'm working on the title. The title tentatively is Be Nice to Me as I Also Buy Your Shit. And, it deals with commercial representation and how few of us appear there. And when we appear, there is a selection process of what images of people of color are going to be allowed in the media. But I want to end by making a statement about how to fight this racial grammar, which operates like smog. It's always there, poisoning you, but you only see it from afar. John Newman claimed 225 years ago he experienced a great deliverance that helped him change his ways as a person and as a slave trafficker. He captured this process in the famous line in his Amazing Grace that says, was blind, but now I see. However, neither Newman nor whites truly regained their vision without our assistance. The only proven tool in history to improve whites' eyesight is hell raising, or in black vernacular, showing our color. Hence, our job today, as that of yesterday, is to fight the visible and invisible structure of white supremacy. We must organize, we must force vision on our torturers, to quote Fanon, and we must be out there in the mean streets of America demanding equality of results now. But I truly want to make one comment on Obama to agitate the audience. I end with what some in the House will interpret as fighting words. We have been in silly season for a year, believing that electing this black man, this neo-mulatto, as president was a great accomplishment. I did not drink of the Obama Hope liquor, so in truth, I see the whole Obama phenomenon as part of the long march toward a multi-racial white supremacy order. Anyone who comes from the Caribbean knows that leaders should be judged not by the color of their skin, but of the content of their politics. That should have been the criteria for us to judge Obama. So in Obamerica, by which I mean Obama elected president without a social movement behind or even around him, an even deeper tectonic plate of racial grammar to hide and help erase race from view has been said. And in Obamerica, like in the old America, some will still be more equal than others. Thank you.
Okay, well, I too want to thank you for having me here today. I'm delighted, but I also must say that I struggled a bit to figure out exactly how I fit into the conference. As I sat yesterday and thought about what was going on here, it became really clear to me that, in fact, not only do I fit, but this is a very good space. And what I hope today is that I could maybe push the conversation a little bit about the idea of colorblindness and what colorblindness as an ideology might actually do, or in some cases exclude, when we talk about different groups. In this case, I want to talk about American Indians. I want to make an argument, and this is not a new argument, but I want to use this argument to link to the idea of colorblindness, and that is this idea of invisibility as a modern form of discrimination. Now, when we think of colorblindness, and here I really am taking from my colleague sitting in the chair next to me, is that colorblind ideologies propose that race and ethnicity are irrelevant to social life and seek to make invisible the experiences and consequences of racism. Now, I argue today that American Indians pose an interesting case for considering ideas of colorblindness because in contemporary society, as a group, contemporary American Indians have been rendered invisible. Not just do you not see our race, but you don't see us at all. When we think about this invisibility, right, it's not just a case of ignoring or setting aside the issues of Native people. It is an active process of writing out American Indians from contemporary life. Now, when we take, just as one example, the domain of the media, what you see is that across several content analyses, American Indians are completely absent, or in some cases there are one or two little representations, and when we think about the content of those representations, they're not about me, people like me today, they're about 18th and 19th century American Indians. The case has been made, not by me, but by numerous Native scholars, that in fact contemporary Native people have been frozen in history, essentially frozen in time. And what I want to do today is I want to take a specific case, one in which I have looked at in terms of psychological consequences, but I want to take this case and make an argument that there is a larger story to be told. And that is the case of the American Indian mascot issue. Now, this particular issue tends to resolve around whether American Indian mascots honor American Indians or harm American Indians. Now, the people who claim that it honors American Indians are making the case that putting up this imagery, holding them up publicly, in some way takes the history and the tradition of Native people and it shines the spotlight on them in a way that is intended to direct honor towards these people. Now, many Native people, in particular a large percentage of Native scholars who have been put in a position to have a voice for Native people, have tried to call this idea into question. Now, my hope is that you're the choir, and so I can be a little provocative about this, but in reality, it's a form of dehumanizing Native people. That when you look at these, what really are negative stereotypes, and the way in which they get used in sports arenas, in school contexts, that it really takes real Native people to a level of being a caricature. Now, what I want to do instead of setting up this issue is I very quickly am going to give you one example from a couple of examples, but each from various papers. And what I want to do is just set up how we can understand this invisibility. So first, we did this simple priming study where we exposed Native high school students to different imagery of American Indians that are available in the media. Now, we did this based on the content analysis. What were the most popular images? And here, one of the conditions was Pocahontas. Another was Chief Wahoo, which is the Cleveland Indians mascot. Then we had this negative stereotyping condition. Now, we tried to have an image to represent this, but it turns out that we tried pre-testing many images, and we either couldn't convince them that it was Native people, right? Or we couldn't get them to sort of buy the social condition. So instead, we presented Native students with the most common negative stereotypes about Native people, namely high dropout rates, high suicide rates, and alcoholism. Then we measured self-esteem, and in study one we measured self-esteem, but we've actually replicated this effect using how students feel about their community, what effect it has on their achievement-related future goals. And consistently across studies, what we find is that compared to a control condition where we don't bring any Native imagery, popular Native imagery to mind, all of these other images reduce self-esteem. Okay. It's not that surprising given the negative stereotyping literature. But keep in mind here, Pocahontas and Chief Wahoo actually reduce self-esteem significantly more than the negative stereotypes, which says something very powerful about imagery and what imagery can do. Now, as I mentioned, right, we find these other negative effects. Reduced community efficacy, right? So they have a reduced sense of what their community can achieve in the future. They also report fewer achievement-related possible selves. Now let's turn the tide. Okay, we then conducted the same study with European Americans, and lo and behold, in all conditions they get a boost in self-esteem. Now, again, right, this might not be so surprising on some level, but it doesn't stop there. It isn't the case that they just get a boost in self-esteem. We went on to do some different ways of taking this effect and thinking about why. I mean, why, for example, should it be good to use this imagery if you're European American? It's certainly not okay to use other racial imagery in society. We've already decided that, in fact, it's inappropriate. And so we created some studies where we tried to make the imagery, we lost the imagery, never mind, I will explain, where we tried to make it very simple, where we put it on a research assistant student's t-shirt, right? He takes off his sweatshirt, he's European American, right? And we do all of these studies, and one of the things that comes up is that we find that across, actually we saw it earlier, it's interesting that we don't get anything now. Okay, so anyway, across the different studies, what we consistently find is that if the European American male has some type of native imagery, other European Americans like him more and feel more similar to him. So not only is it okay, but this European American male incurs absolutely no social cost for engaging in the practice of using American Indian mascots. Now, a couple of points I want to bring to mind here that are of interest is that we actually took some of the American Indian data back to the reservation, and we showed Native children, right, some of the that it has negative effects, but that many of them said they liked Native American mascots. And we asked them, and the entire focus group centered around issues of invisibility. These kids said, I would rather be a mascot than be invisible. And so I want to end today by talking about some of the negative, I note unintended in red, right? Because people hate the idea that they're using Native mascots as a way to intentionally harm Native people, right? But that these kinds of representations have unintended and negative effects. In particular, I just want to show you a few images. This is from Berkeley. No offense, I realize you're our rivals, but right, here was a poster back when Stanford was the Indians, right? We are the fighting Californians for the blue and gold. We are starting on a warpath for a scalp or two. Our blood's up and simply boiling. What can Stanford do? We are starting on the warpath for a scalp or two. What is the imagery that's being invoked here? As you continue down, you'll also find that in the image, they make Stanford female, right? Clearly intended to be derogative. Okay, we've seen these sort of improvements made by universities trying to make their mascots more respectable, but here's some of the imagery that ends up coming up as a result, right? So it's not just whether you use it, but what does it allow the other side, the opposition, to do? And finally, is it really harming if okay, well, we lost another image. Oh, here it is. This was put on the American Indian Studies door. And the whole idea here, right, so they're honoring us, but when the Native people want to get rid of it, right, if you get rid of the Fighting Sioux, then we get rid of your free schooling, right? No, drink 'em lots of fire water, pay taxes, find something better for your time, like a job, live at the reservation for free, you lost the war. Sorry. Yes, it sounds like honoring. And so I just want to end today with a couple of points, which are, there we go. So until we as a society recognize that the role that social contexts play in creating identities, we will continue to ignore the harm that selective representations of American Indians impose. The issue of the mascot is not a trivial issue, right? In fact, it really represents the larger cultural context, one in which contemporary American Indians don't exist. We like the historical imagery of American Indians. We want to play with it. We'll play Indians, right? We can romanticize it in a variety of ways. But actually, as long as we don't have to pay attention to contemporary American Indians. And in fact, most Americans, as Cornell Pee Wee Werdy's work shows, don't know a contemporary Native person. And so it allows us, right, as long as we keep them out of the spotlight, we don't show them in the media, we don't talk about them in schools, it allows this kind of small process or practice to have a big impact on the lives of Native people. And I end by saying that once again, the beneficiaries of this invisibility are European Americans. Thank you.
Substantively, we have a lot put on the table in powerful ways, and I thank all the panelists for doing that. I want to ask a few questions. It is thankfully my prerogative at the very beginning. And in part, what I want to do is to focus on one of the themes, which is bigger pictures and about methodology. So here's, like, Stephanie's work right at the very end does two really interesting things, right? She wants to talk about invisibility and the existence of particular representations within our media culture and the lack of other kinds of representations. And she says that there's a consequence on people's, on Native people, especially the youth's, actual self-concept and esteem. And the way she goes about doing it is to actually expose them through stimuli, through an intervention and control, and measure, either through explicit self-reports or whatever other mechanism, what the actual self-esteem scores look like. She shows you bar charts, and you are impressed. Does it honor or does it harm? You now think there's scientific data that it actually harms, even if you ask them, would you rather have this or not, and they say, I'd rather be a mascot than nothing. But why do you believe her? In part, it's because she's mindful of the media culture. She has a theory about it, but what she did was do a test on individuals and get bar charts. Okay? There's a reason why I'm emphasizing that, because in many things, even the work, like the work that Vicki Mays has done, when she focuses on the health impacts of discrimination or the perception of a hostile environment, she is actually measuring individual health outcomes, right? So if we're trying to figure out what we're doing here, in this entire panel, I mean, maybe Eduardo goes farthest in terms of his being provocative in certain ways, on the question of whether science versus non-science plays a role. Even Eduardo, when he focuses on a white woman, missing white woman syndrome, he also not only notices it, but he has his graduate students count, right, through transcripts on how often the word beautiful is used on CNN. So whether it's science or non-science, in some sense we have picked scientific methods, not as the exclusive way to certainly persuade people, for humor and powerful stories, all lawyers know are important, but science versus non-science, we hear science throughout the whole thing, right? Now, what about the unit of analysis? Do you pick the individual as the unit of analysis, or do you pick the group or structure, right? Is it a racial grammar? Or is it individual implicit biases? Or do we really have to choose? You can actually, the claim is, translate many of the things as interoperable and as parallel descriptions of things that are going on. And that's part of the conversation that I want to have. So maybe I'll start off by, like, for example, when Tristin starts and says one of the concerns she has about the way that the law has used some of this science is that it is insufficiently relational. Also, that it has failed to capture what people might call hot cognition or emotions, the response might be, well, maybe law professors have done it badly. Law professors will often do things badly, including economics when they pull it in. But there's much within standard social psychology that understands relational behavior. The whole point of it being not cognitive psychology, but social psychology, is that you're understanding social relationships and emphasizing the situation and not making the fundamental attribution error. Moreover, we know the difference between stereotypes and attitudes. We know what motivational psychology, including hot psychology, might actually mean, which means that we're actually taking into account emotions. There's no reason why it can't be done. So the goal here is in part to literally pick a fight, to try to figure out, too many times I've heard people, oh, you don't get it because you picked this level of analysis. You think it's in people's heads and you don't understand culture. Or you only think about culture, you're doing this vague, ambiguous, complaining stuff. Let's go measure people's brains. I see reductionism both ways in some sense. And I'm going to try to figure out, are we all on one page here? Such that, no, we could use different units of analysis, solve the problem, we should all go ahead and do it. Or is there really a problem to solve about people doing certain types of work which crowds out other types of work, either consensually, either in terms of concepts or maybe in terms of resources or even just attention in the law reviews or legal policymaking world. And I want to really try to figure out, as we try to bring the social science, and I know Valerie's going to be talking about much of this in her lunch address, do we have to make a choice? Individual versus group. Let's just focus on that. Are you comfortable that we're actually analyzing at the right unit of analysis, or do we have to make choices? Because if we have to make choices, we ought to think about that right now. Jump in?
Well, it's easy for me because I think it is a problem of lawyers and the legal scholarship, not a problem of the social science. So I don't know, I realize there may also be a debate going on within the social science, but that's something the social scientists have to solve, or at least put forward to us as the legal scholars to work together to bring it into legal scholarship.
I don't agree. I think it's our problem, and I really believe that the issue is we have to do team science here, and that's the real problem we have. Is I go off and do one thing and have one definition, you go off and do something else. I mean, one of the things that I value is the interaction that, as a social scientist, I'm having with the law school. I now understand better your problems so that I can develop the science. There was something I skipped, and I just want to read this because it is so what you're saying. There's an article out, and it's called Voodoo Correlations in Social Neuroscience. And I read it last night, and I read all the critiques about it, and it really is attacking. If you haven't seen it and you do work in implicit bias, you should read it. Because what it did was that it was, and I say this to the law students because it was a graduate student that was the head of this powerful article with 3 senior colleagues. But there is a quote in that one of the commentators said, like so many researchers in social science, psychologists have physics envy and think that the illusionary precision and solidity of neuroimaging can give their field some rigor. And I think what's being said to us is we were really taken to the cleaners about the science. They go through and say, this normally wouldn't have gotten accepted. This is really kind of weak. It's like, there were a lot of criticisms, but it was out there, and it made it in the best, it was in Nature and some of the best of our journals. And the question is, you raised this issue about bad acts, and I'm going to raise it about bad actors. And instead of talking about bad acts, I think what it is it's bad actors, and we're not saying who's bad. We've been very polite the whole meeting. And there are some bad actors, and those bad actors do work where they don't know culture and race. They don't spend the time, for example, I think on both sides we do this, we don't spend enough time educating ourselves about what the real, the whole landscape is. And so there are bad actors, and I think in developing new science, we have to call out the bad actors. I think and not by name, but by method, by tradition, and by what we think is the imperative of what needs to be in the science.
But so on the one hand, in part because you didn't call out names, it's easy to agree.
Oh,
right?
I can.
No,
I can.
I'm not asking you to call out names. No,
I'm a guest.
I'm
a guest, so I'm going to act right.
No, but here's the hard part. Here's the hard part, because
Yes.
in every conversation, whether it is global warming, whether secondhand smoke causes cancer, there's a predictable politicization when science enters the policymaking realm. And it goes something like this, right? There is a orthodoxy that starts where there's no problem. Then there is new evidence suggesting, wait, there might be a problem, i.e. smoking might cause cancer, or human activity might actually lead to global warming. Then there's inevitably, whether it's sincere or motivated reasoning or completely fraudulent, a pushback that says, oh, no, all this new science, what do we know? The regressions might be bad, the data's not good, type 1, type 2 errors, I'm not sure about ecological validity. Hold on, we don't know. The technique is to manufacture doubt, regardless of whether you believe there's doubt, in order to stave off interventions. And you cloak yourself within the garb of science. All I want is good science. Anyone who knows what what certain administrations did with the requirements for data quality review and peer review, principally to stave off regulation, understands that this technique can be used. So the difficulty is, on the one hand, we all want good, responsible, and comprehensive understandings using the best methods at every level, including scientific and non-scientific. The danger, unfortunately, it seems to me, is that you'll have many people who say, oh, what do we know? It's just a regression. There's no implicit bias. What do we know? There's no actually good math. What do we know about the strength of switching costs and the power of lock-in, right? We can go to Schumpeterian economics and say all markets are contestable. Even Microsoft might lose to Google, or the next Google that will happen 2 days from now that we don't even know. And so it gets complicated because the politics cut in multiple directions, where the exact same argument will be used by people who, broadly speaking, cannot possibly be on the same page as the clear majority of this group. And so that's the harder questions that exist, and I wanted to see if other people would chime in and try to make things clearer for me.
Well, I guess I'll be a little impolite and say a couple of provocative things and poke you a little bit, Jerry. I guess two things. One, I think when scholars in law decide to use social science, they inherit both the blessings and the curses that come with that, and they have to be prepared to fight fights that they're, in some sense, fighting out of their field, right? So we, as legal scholars, are going to necessarily have less credibility when it comes to, and we are going to be piggybacking off of, the fights that get fought in psychology on implicit bias, for example. And that is intrinsically one of the responsibilities, or responsibility is the wrong word, but one of the tasks that you're going to have to deal with when you're using social science to push an argument. And this is where I'll get even more provocative, which is to say that when critical race theory takes on the tools of social science, and I hear about this all the time with regard to my project, what sort of ways in which social science might potentially co-opt the program, co-opt the argument. And there, I guess, I'll poke you a little bit on the unit of analysis question, which is to say that when Kim told the story about critical race theory yesterday, I was really struck by how much the initial wave of critical race theory really did focus on structure, institution, and group. And the way in which, as critical race theory has lost its firepower or fashionability, once we now seek to revive it, we are turning, almost paradoxically in my view, to focus on the individual and the sub-individual stage without necessarily, this is totally self-serving on my part to say all of this, without necessarily focusing adequately at the same time, simultaneously, on history and power as those operate at the level of the group and the level of the structure. It's okay, we had our brief dalliance with Marx, and now we're over that. But social science offers us ways to do that too, and I think we need to focus on those.
A few comments from the other ones, and then I'll take some questions.
Yeah, I've been working hard, at least the last 20 years of my life, to achieve some mental emancipation from mental slavery, and that mental slavery connects also with the science project, because in the name of science I have been called stupid, I have been called ugly, I have been called all kinds of names. So what I do is I use science as a tool for counter-ideological fights. I'm not trying to end up in some kind of absolute relativism here, but I'm just pointing out that science is also a cultural production, and as such, we cannot idealize it and assume this beyond sort of the terrain of critique. And we have now a discipline, a field called science studies, Bruno Latour and a bunch of folks, who now are being criticized for some of their myopia on race stuff, yeah? But there is now that sort of engagement of a critique of the science and the canons and who is in the production of science. In terms of statistics, Tukufu Zubeiri, who was here giving a talk yesterday, wrote a beautiful book on racial statistics, and the whole statistical project was founded upon white supremacy. I mean, it's clear. All the founding fathers of statistics were sort of into eugenics. So now, that said, I will use science, I will count. For me, the ideology, in the counter-ideological struggle, I will use whatever I have to use to defeat my opponent. But at the end of the day, we have to also be clear and not confuse our counter-ideological battles with other larger battles that are necessary to defeat our enemy. If we don't have that clarity, we end up in sort of a mental game that is beautiful and feels good, and we are like, wow, I really have now scientific data showing this and that. And remember that whenever we produce these beautiful articles we produce that show things such as black folks are 2.5% more likely to be unemployed than whites, there is what I'm sort of fumbling to call a race grammar that allows some people to read that scientific finding as what? Evidence of what? They're lazy. I can show you empirically, and even when I give the explanation of the reason why we have an overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system is because of racism, in the white imagination, they already have the answer. And it's what? Because they're criminal. So therefore, although I will use all the tools, science, culture, poetry, my fist if needed, or my feet if needed, and put it in the right place, let's be clear that we need to have that, we have to be able to defend our interests by any means necessary.
Stephanie?
It's hard to always go last. They've said all the good things. Actually, I was kind of thinking, though, as Daria was talking, that I don't think that's provocative enough. I mean, I think really we have to just ask ourselves, I mean, we exist in a hierarchical racist system, period. I mean, the academy is itself racist and hierarchical. And, you know, we've all chosen this as a tool, and we have found examples of where this tool has been used to help. And I think that's sort of what I heard you saying at the end, but I think until we really acknowledge the ways in which the world we exist in on our everyday contain all types of invisible social structures intended to keep us silent, to keep us from pushing new knowledge generation forward, intended to keep us within a framework. I mean, I think about my own field, right? I think social psychology, we heard Claude Steele refer to it as a church last weekend, and he's right. I mean, it's like this church we're supposed to belong to. We're supposed to buy into this rhetoric, and we're supposed to pray the right way and walk the right way and dress the right way and do all these things the right way. But, you know, for some of us, I think we might have to be part of the church, but maybe we need to not buy into the rhetoric. And so as we think about, you know, my own field, I mean, science, one of the biggest problems of science is the mismeasurement of science, right? You can only publish significant differences. You don't get to publish all the ways in which people are the same. I mean, it was the primary way in which Carol Tavris talked about the mismeasure of women, right? For the longest time, science focused on all the ways in which women were different, and that usually meant deficient, as opposed to the ways in which women were the same, which was an important part of filling the gap in terms of recognizing that women were as capable as men. And second, in psychology, there was a book that came out that said even the rats were white. And it's true. Most of what we know about basic human functioning is about whites. And really, I mean, I think for those of us who exist in stereotyping and prejudice, who exist in cultural psychology, you know, those are, I think, cultural psychology, more than stereotyping and prejudice, are marginalized groups. And, you know, we should ask ourselves, why are they marginalized? Why are they two different groups, right? I mean, why is culture somehow different than race? Are we really that different? No, but actually, you know, is it important as a field to keep us separate, right? Do we gain more ground if we learn to talk to each other? And so I just think it's really important for us to acknowledge the ways in which there are a multitude of social academic structures in place to keep us from achieving what we need to achieve. And the question is, how do we have to change the structure in order, right? I mean, because there are problems of getting tenure, all of these other issues that come up, right, that also force us to behave. But how do we not behave and still be successful? And I do believe there's a way to do it.
So I know that there's more comments. I want to just get a couple more questions from the audience on the table, and then we'll have more. Wow, jeez. Okay, Daria.
Thanks. I love this discussion. Of course, we in law want to use the tools of science to craft our strongest arguments, and we in science care about what we're giving to the law or to other fields, or what law is drawing on, what law is borrowing, what law is benefiting from, or using, or co-opting. There is an ethics at play here, and I heard that in what Vicki was saying especially. I think the key here is how we make this translation. There are acts of translation in taking science into law. It's a translation between genres, and it might be hard to notice that there are ethical questions about that. What does that mean? At least a bit in what Daria was saying, I could hear you approach the word responsibility and back off. There is a responsibility because there is an inheritance. There is a heritage going from science into law, and there's science coming in as cultural property. So there's an ethics in respecting that culture when it comes into law. And that doesn't mean there aren't bad actors within science, but there's also a potential for bad acts in importing science.
Okay, so I'm going to do Heaven up front and Ron back there, right? So these two, and then I'll let the panelists respond. Yeah.
So I'm trying to make this as sort of concrete as possible. So in the interest of trying to tie together, coming from a sort of empirical psychological perspective, and trying to understand how sort of legal domains can use science. So Tristan, you mentioned something that struck me, and correct me if I'm wrong in sort of interpreting this. You said that one domain where race may be relevant as consideration is as framed as a method of preventing discrimination. And in that regard, so as a scientist, what can you, as specifically as possible, and I guess this is posed to all sort of legal scholars out there, what is specifically the type of data or methodologies that, so for example, if I ran a study and I showed you that when I prime people with a colorblind ideology, they are less capable of perceiving discrimination objectively, is that something that can fuel a legal sort of traction and momentum? As specifically as possible, any legal scholar, tell me what are the types of findings, dependent measures that sort of can gain that momentum? That would be really...
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly on point, which is why we need these kinds of collaborative ventures, because the law professors at this point often don't know the questions to ask. So it actually needs to be a conversation between someone who knows how it works and someone who doesn't have social science background who's trying to incorporate that into legal arguments. And what we're left with now, what tends to happen is this sort of, searching for what would like looking at the social science that already exists and building the arguments out from that. And I think that's where it's actually been very useful to this kind of importing of the implicit bias work, is because it was the first time, in a long time at least, that law professors sat down with social scientists and started saying, how does this work? How can we make the argument together? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that sounds like a terrific experiment that we could use in one way or another. We'd figure out how that was useful from a discrimination perspective, how to make it most politically and normatively traction. I mean, I think that's another question that Sam Bagenstos would have brought up had he been here, was that he would have taken me to task for relying too much on the social science, because there's another question that has to come in, which is, can this ever actually politically work? At what point should you be arguing for moves in discrimination law that can actually affect meaningful change, or are you just making a mess of everything?
So I'll let Vicky talk, and then take Ron's question, and then one more question, and then we've got 5 more minutes or so. Yeah.
This is what worries me, is when you ask the attorneys to tell you the method, et cetera. This is the issue for me. No, but and that's it. I think it's more what concerns you. The problem that I really worry about is that you're buying something that you shouldn't buy all the time, and you're taking it to a place where it affects all of us. Now, if you can litigate and change law, it affects us all. Now, I can put a study in the journal. It could be as flawed can be, and not necessarily have the same power and impact. So I can, read stuff and kind of let it go out there, and it's like we say, oh, that's in a journal of such and such, and we know that's a weak journal. But I have to worry if you take things and you really can make a change occur. Because look how long it takes to undo something. So what I get, maybe I'm giving you more power than you have. Maybe I'm just wrong here. But I am concerned.
You think the scientists have the power? Scientists are we
yeah,
have the
but
power.
I am concerned that you can't take the science and just take it. It's almost like what you say. You inherit a lot of things, and you've got to find people to talk to tell you, other than the person who did the science, what's wrong with what you took, so that you know how to really reframe it to work in your world, but still have integrity from what we know to be the problems in our world.
Okay, so I did say Ron in the back, and then we'll take. We're going to go a little bit longer on this panel, like I was told 5-10 minutes, but then let's start up there, Ron, and then I see my colleague Cheryl Harris, who insists. So, and I got to respect that. Yeah. Ron, yeah.
She's giving us face.
Due to my biracial background, I tend to approach things in terms of bringing opposites together. And I basically created a hybrid field of sociological cognitive neuroscience. Not just social cognitive, sociological, because I am a social scientist. I'm at UC Santa Barbara. Howie is one of the great people over there. But what I'm attempting to do is bring the sociological perspective to cognitive neuroscience. And so as I participated in the law and neuroscience program up at UC Santa Barbara, I have had to engage in fights by myself because I don't have colleagues who are, I'm not running deep with colleagues. So I've had so for me, it's like the analogy would be playing, if you're a basketball player, playing on the opposing team's court every night, the entire season is on somebody else's floor, or with a hostile environment. And so what I have found in the world of the cognitive neuroscientists up there is they've got $10 million from the Gartner Foundation to do this program, right? Now, what they're interested in is looking at the criminal mind. Now, what I'm interested in is looking at the mind of the cop, the mind of the jury, the mind of the person that's testifying, the mind of the judge, and looking at the implicit biases. We have a lot of the neuroscience data now in terms of people looking at this stuff, Elizabeth Phelps, et cetera, Mazren and Jerry's working with this kind of stuff. But because, and thinking of the network component of this, we don't have our network together in terms of to be able to politically engage in a way that we are running deep. And if we got a message, and we're coordinating our activities to take these people on. And I'll mention a couple of other names, Mitchell and Tetlock. Okay, so as an example of people who, they're running deep. They've got institutional conservative elements, the think tanks and all the rest of the stuff. We're so isolated doing our individual studies, all doing this, that, and the other. That's where we have to put our networks together so we can be politically engaged in the scientific world so that they're not running the game in terms of how the money gets spent to continue the stereotype, for instance, in the law of neuroscience, that we need to get into that criminal's mind and figure him out. You know, we need to really get into the people's minds who are making us criminals just because of the way we look.
Sherlers?
So I've been thinking about this toggling between the question of the individual as a unit of analysis and the structure as a unit of analysis. And I guess, you know, it's somewhat, as time goes on, becomes clear to me that it's the point that I think Eduardo makes, which is the way in which, and to some extent Daria from a different angle, the way in which racism perpetuates itself in the absence of intentionality, by a kind of deep structure. And one of the languages that we have from sociology is this idea of frames, which is frames trump facts. Facts, what science generates in the form of empirical facts can be reinterpreted and retold in any number of ways so that the frame, for example, will tell us what correlations make sense, right? The frame will tell us the correlations make no sense in the absence of the frame, in the absence of a normative theory, in the absence of something that tells us why this correlation, say, for example, between smoking and lung cancer actually makes sense. There has to be some kind of framework, some kind of theory about the way the body works that tells us why that correlation is meaningful. Now, the problem that I see is that work that supports the prevailing frame, say, for example, like Richard Sanders' work. Richard Sanders' work supports the prevailing frame that says that black people are intellectually deficient. That work does not have to meet empirical standards. That work does not have to meet any threshold because it fits a prevailing framework. So it seems to me that we have to have a method of intervention that understands that it will not be simply our disclosure of existing facts that will somehow move this structure. There has to be some understanding, it seems to me, that says if we're going to make meaningful interventions here, that if we're going to think about this here, this isn't simply a question of either an either-or unit of analysis, nor is it a question simply of generating sufficient empirical facts. So I guess I just want to say, or make a call here for understanding that if that is so, that our conversation is not simply toggling between these two things, but is trying to figure out a way in which to effect a kind of ideological structure, a normative structure that tells us how we intervene.
That's one of the reasons I backed off the word responsibility, because it made it sound too reverential and deferential to the requirements of science as a discipline without acknowledging the way in which it's inevitably a political activity. To borrow is a political activity. You inherit the political liabilities as well as the political payoffs, and you're going to have to, hash through that and figure out ways to deal with that without being surprised that Mitchell and Tetlock come back and push back on implicit bias.
That's great. unfortunately, we are out of time. People will be here, obviously, to make more discussions, and we'll continue this conversation. Let's give a great round of applause.